This is Desm 101. Thanks for tuning in. And today it's time for another episode of Retro Game Talk. The topic is going to be old school 80s arcade games. I just wanted to relay some memories that I had of a lot of these classic games that I played in the 1980s. So I was born in 1981, and I didn't start going to arcades until about 85, 86. And then really spending a lot of time in there, probably, 87 to onward. So some of these games are ones that really stood out to me. And one of the cool things about the 80s that I remember was that games were everywhere, not just arcades, but you would find them in convenience stores and grocery stores, in random restaurants. There would maybe be like an arcade section with pinball tables. They were just everywhere. So for this episode, I'm capturing the footage through MAME running on my PlayStation TV. And it runs pretty good. You'll probably hear some sound issues here and there, but overall, it's fairly consistent. It's a bit better than when I record from my PC, which capturing it makes it go kind of awry. Alright, so here's Shinobi. Everyone knows Shinobi, a top flagship title from Sega, released in 1987. And I've always had a certain fondness for the game. It was one of those titles that would be the first ones I would go to whenever I'd go to an arcade and see it around, especially in the late 80s. And of course, ninjas were really popular, and this type of gameplay, side-scrolling platformer, was always a lot of fun. This one just did it in such a cool, stylized way, and it used ninjas pretty accurately to what you would kind of imagine them to be like as a kid, aside from the fact that Joe Musashi doesn't have his mask on, which, yeah, as a kid I always thought that was really awkward. But still, I spent a lot of time playing this game and a lot of quarters. So on this episode, it's just me playing through 1 quarter on each game to kind of just see how far I could get, but also give you an idea. That's how the gameplay was back then. It was usually very common that you'd just go and spend 1 quarter on a game and then go to another one, especially if you were low on cash or low on funds, whatever. So this game was always really tough. I remember I would challenge myself to see how far I could get without using ninja magic, and even then I would usually die without getting a chance to use it. But it just has that nice balance of, using really precise timing and jumps and getting close using melee attacks. I feel like none of the other ports of this game could really do it justice. Like on the TurboGrafx 16, it looks just like it, but it's missing the melee attack. I love that when the boss dies, how it has that kind of shadow falling behind him. But I still to this day have never beat this game. It's incredibly difficult. Once you get to the last stage, you actually can't continue, so you have to do it with whatever remaining lives you have left. And there's just ninjas flying everywhere doing like these spin attacks, and they're really hard to hit. They're almost impossible to kill. So oh yeah, and for these bonus stages, my strategy is to just basically press the button as fast as you can and try and time it along with when the guys are showing up there. Sometimes you can get lucky and get a bonus like I did there. Even out of the other sequels, I think this one was my favorite. They are good. Probably Shinobi, the third one, Shinobi 3, is the second best in my opinion. And the Revenge of Shinobi was good, but that double jump move is just really weird. The timing on it, I still haven't quite got the hang of it. But it does have all those cool bosses, like swapped depending on the version, like Godzilla and Batman, Spider-Man. But yeah, I make some pretty stupid mistakes sometimes when I'm playing this game. If you let the bad guys get too close to you, or you just screw a jump up or like that. It's pretty frustrating sometimes, but that's just what happens. And as far as 1 coin on this game, I would probably be able to usually make it to the second boss if I'm lucky, but it was probably more common that I would get to the red stage, the next one, and usually die there. And there's just a lot of spots where you can't tell who's above you when you're going up, and it'll catch you off guard if you don't have it memorized. So that was another key thing, is that you would play these games a bunch and just totally memorize them. That would lengthen the amount of playtime, of course. And as a kid, I loved how the enemy ninjas looked. I kind of wish you could maybe pick a different skin for your character that looked more like one of those outfits, but with like a dark gray or a blue color. But yeah, Sega was really incredible back then. I mean, Sega's still pretty good now, but in these days, they were a force to be reckoned with in the arcades. I could probably make this whole video just about Sega games because they were so memorable and left such an impression on me. But I wanted to split it up a little bit more. But this one was always one of the top Sega games, in my opinion. A bunch of them, like Space Harrier, were very impressive. But this one just had that perfect balance of gameplay and art style. Along with that challenge, of course. Yep, again, one of those guys got too close. I guess that's what happens when you're not careful. Alright, for the next game, it's one that everyone's very familiar with, Golden Axe, a true classic, and another Sega game. This one came out in 1989, and it continues what I was saying about Sega really being on top of their game during the 80s. So of course everyone played a lot of Double Dragon and some Renegade, which those are great games, very fun and innovative for the beat 'em up. But this game really did a number for the beat 'em up genre before Final Fight. I know Final Fight's considered one of the main important beat 'em up games that really started it into a huge direction. But this here was a nice balance of that old school classic, like Double Dragon kind of beat 'em up game. But it had that really amazing detail and really graphic kind of violence. I felt like it captured the spirit of those 80s movies like Conan the Barbarian and Red Sonja. What else? There was some like Barbarian Brothers. Can't remember if that was in the 80s or 90s, but those are pretty awesome movies. And I felt like that was a very popular genre in general for entertainment, was fantasy and kind of like old swords and sorcery kind of storylines and things like that were very popular. Frank Frazetta's artwork was really big in that type of fantasy art. So yeah, you saw it a lot in video games, and I feel like Golden Axe just had a really nice, appealing element to it, specifically with things like the creatures. Right, so the game is populated with all these different types of creatures, from the enemies that you can ride on, like the dragons and those chicken leg things, but also you travel on the back of a giant turtle, travel on the back of a giant bird. Those are pretty awesome things, especially as a kid. It was kind of unfathomable how they came up with that. Back in those days, you would be playing and it would just be astounding. And then once you knew how it looked, and when you see the big eyes of the animals as you're crossing over the top of them, that just left a massive kind of impression. And as a kid, you always wondered how they came up with that. Now, this is the first game that I beat in the arcade. There was one particular day where my dad left me with $5 at the arcade. I was pretty young, and this game had just come out, and I figured, I'm just gonna see how many coins it takes to play through the whole thing. And one of the interesting parts about games back then is that some of them were not ones where like you could necessarily beat it if you just kept on putting coins in there. You'd get sent back every time, or it'd be just game over, and there wasn't continues. For the really old games, you had to just play it as good as you could on one coin and see what your score is. But this kind of game was very smart for arcade retailers and things, because they could make a lot of money off of it, because kids would put as much coins as they could to see if they could beat the game. And it was really satisfying. As a kid, I was just totally amazed at what happens at the end and how gory it is when you see the blood coming out from Death Adder. And it was just one of the coolest things that I had ever seen at that point. And the Sega Genesis version is pretty tough. I actually have never beat that one. I can usually make it to the final area where there's those cheap gaps that you have to jump across, and then you have to fight that final boss who can spam the special magic attacks against you. So I always get stuck there, and I've never actually been able to beat the Sega Genesis version, but they're both really good versions of this game. Of course, the arcade sound effects are super memorable. They're from movies at the time. Can't remember, I think it's like a Rambo movie has the bad guys scream in it. Such a great look to the fantasy element in that type of world that you see here. It's quite believable and colorful and very appealing how it looks. So I used to play this at an arcade called Yesterday's in the Mesilla Valley Mall, which is by where I grew up. And this was a really interesting arcade. At one end of the mall, it kind of extended out near one of the doors, the main entrances. You could go into this little side entrance. I remember it was an arched doorway with a small marquee at the top that said Yesterday's written in stained glass. And it looked pretty nice, like a bar kind of logo. And when you went in there, it was a pretty small room. It was kind of like a long rectangle shape. And they had arcade games all along the walls, and then a row in the middle back to back. And then at the end of one of the sides, there was some deluxe cabinets. So you would see the games like Thunderblade and Hang On, a couple other Sega arcade games. And that's one of the very awesome things about Sega back then too, is that they were very committed to making these big, huge, intricate cabinets that had a big wow factor in terms of you would walk into an arcade and you would just see some of these major Sega games that would have all this flashy presentation going on just the arcade cabinet. And they would have special deluxe ones with hydraulics, and you know, there was a version of Afterburner that had a moving cockpit that you would sit inside. That was just incredible. It would be really expensive though, I remember back then. I always love this map screen, how it tells you the story of where you're going and you're riding on the back of the turtle. I love the music during that part too. It gives this nice moody kind of very simple melody, but it gives a nice kind of vibe for the game. It's a real dark, moody kind of game in some ways. And of course, all these dragons are amazing too. You can shoot fireballs or shoot fire on the ground. You can charge with them. I think I did okay for one coin. I would have liked to make it a bit further on this one. And this would always happen where you're trying to get on the back of the animal and then keep getting knocked off, and you and the other enemies keep trading off trying to get on the animal. And I always wondered if there was a limit to how many times you can hit this guy, if whenever he's running away off screen, if you can keep spamming attacking him and keep getting more things off of him. And there's the head of that turtle. I love that. You can see the eye moving. And these guys come back, so it kind of was common back then too that you would get a boss who would end up becoming a regular enemy later on. So like these guys were the boss of the first stage, and now they're just kind of like near the end of the level, but they're not the boss this time. Well, another interesting thing about this game was how it rates you. And that was pretty rare even then, that you would get a game that would tell you a rating on how you did based on performance. I don't remember caring too much about it, but it's just a really interesting kind of look at the... I mean, I guess high score tables are pretty similar. But this is just a unique way of telling you, you know, what's your strength. And it puts you in a class. I guess I did okay. I used to always play as Gilius Thunderhead when I was a kid because I thought, you know, he had the golden axe, so that was kind of the best guy to play as. Gauntlet. Now, this is a game that came out before the other two. It's 1985. But I remember this was a huge deal when it came out. 4-player games weren't super common. I think Warlords was another one that was 4 players. And then there's a couple other like racing games or something. Maybe that Super Sprint. And then later Off-Road. But yeah, this was a very, very popular game when it first came out. I remembered my dad would take me to the bowling alley when I was very young. And he was in a bowling league. And he would let me just hang out in the arcade area and give me a couple dollars to play through some games. And when this one came out, or whenever they got it in that arcade, there was a line of people that were wanting to play it. And I remember people would put their coins up on the top of where the control stick is to indicate that they were in line next if you would quit your game. So yeah, this is an indication of how a lot of older games would give you these instructions on the demo screen, or on the attract mode. It would give you all these score ratings. So again, this is another game that is really interested in capturing that fantasy, barbarians and sorcerers and swordplay kind of medieval type of atmosphere. And I think it does a pretty good job of it. I love that title screen. Now that's one of the best old school title screens, I feel like, from this time period. It's got the blood there on the Morning Star. And you've got the great detail on their armor. They've got symmetry between them, so they're balanced with the text. And it has that gradient color scroll through it. That's just some really good, really nice looking design. So the speech was another big thing at this time. The speech sounded fairly realistic when you compare it to something like Life Force from the arcade, or those Konami games like Blades of Steel, which had pretty awful voice quality. And this one sounded pretty good. You could understand it well. It sounded like a computerized voice. Like they were generating it from a computer, like a typing program. But it sounded really good. Oh, and this game was also really well known for filling the screen with enemies. Oh, that's it. Yeah, so with this game, it was your life was based on the coins. So normally you would just keep inserting coins to keep your character alive longer, but since it was just one coin, the game was over faster than the credits at the beginning and the instructions. Black Tiger is one from Capcom that follows that same medieval Dungeons and Dragons kind of theme. And I remember playing this one at a rec center that was on White Sands military base back in the late 80s, where we would play some basketball games, or my dad would work on that base, and sometimes I would just be there hanging out with him while he was doing work. I'd go to the rec center and play this game. And it was a game that I never really saw anywhere else, but I loved it. So anytime he would go there, I'd always ask him if I could go, because I wanted a chance to play a few rounds on this game. It's very difficult. I could never get really far, but again, the art style, this is really showing how Capcom would later go on to make some very incredible looking medieval themed games like Knights of the Round and King of Dragons, Magic Sword. Capcom just had a wealth of games with this kind of theme going on. And I feel like this is one of the ones that really demonstrated how high quality and well polished their games were. I also think of Strider coming out later, kind of similar in terms of platforming, running and jumping. This one has more projectile attacks, of course, but a little similar. This game actually had a spiritual sequel on the TurboGrafx 16. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I think it might be Sun Part 2. But yeah, I love the designs of the dungeons and the enemies in this one. You're in this really dark, kind of cavernous place, and you're saving these old guys who run shops where you can upgrade your weapons. And they also let you go into the dungeon, which is an area where you can find extra treasures and rescue more people to get you more items and things like that. So you can see once you get the upgraded weapon, it does reflect on your character, on the sprite, when you get new armor and everything. And for its time, I feel like that was pretty impressive. It kind of has that RPG element where you can see your character upgrading and leveling up through their item, the items that they acquire. I always wondered what was that weird green thing at the top when you fight the boss. When I was a kid, that boss is kind of scary. The face would always jump on me and land on my character. Usually end at that part. Once I figured out how to beat him, you just stay far away. Pretty simple. And then right away in the next level, you're facing all these really difficult platforming challenges, a lot more jumps and precision involved. And traps, so there'd always be these creatures and things coming up from the floor, so you had to be prepared for things dropping from the ceiling like that rock, and things coming out of the ground. And then of course treasure chests would be trapped, and you would get damage from flames coming out of one of them, things like that. Kind of annoying, how difficult it was, but I guess the challenge was part of the mystique of the game, adding to its interest. Look at that flame guy. That guy, that weird fire demon. So cool. So here's the dungeon. You can see there's a lot more treasure chests and items. So it's usually smart to make a stop in here. Oh, just made a horrible jumping mistake there. That's one of those games where you can't correct your direction in the air when you're jumping. You're basically committed to it once you hit that button. Alright, how about something a little more old school for this one, Moon Patrol. Now this is my idea of what I call an ideal game. It has this wonderful timeless quality and this perfect balance between simplicity, gameplay, and the looks and feel of the game. there's not a ton going on there, but it's just the right amount. You got parallax scrolling, you've got obstacles in your way, you can shoot both up and down, and it's got nice, vivid, bright, beautiful colors. And a very simple system, easy to understand. You know, you're making it through these periodic checkpoints that are lettered from alphabetically. And it's just really quick to pick up and play and figure out. And I feel like this is one of those games that just does all that so very well. And it just holds up to this day perfectly. It's just hasn't aged a day. And I first played this on the Atari. And in my memory, this was one of those games when I finally saw it in the arcade, it was a huge difference. It was so much more vivid and detailed, you know, and it still played great on the 2600, but to see it on the arcade was, a phenomenal experience. It was just one of those realizations that you have when you're younger, that there can be these multiple versions of a game. And I'm still fascinated by that. And it takes a lot of careful planning and careful playing to get through a lot of these spaceships that are attacking you. And, you know, as it goes on, it gets a lot more complex with multitudes of attacks coming at you, rocks that you have to blow up, tanks, things like that. And from what I understand too, this is one of the first games that lets you continue. So up to this point, games were more like those single screen games like Donkey Kong and Pac-Man, where the game would end once you would lose your lives and you wouldn't have the chance to continue. But this is an example of an early game where you could keep continuing, you know, putting another coin in. And from what I understood, that was kind of a big game changer in terms of the high score battles, because if you could continue your score, then the skill for obtaining that was less relevant than it had been up to that point. But yeah, look at that great detail on the buildings in the back. As a kid, I'd always wonder, you know, how'd they come up with that, and what's going on. But, you know, is that an alien city back there? I guess that's what it's supposed to be, or maybe a base of some kind. But very great retro futuristic look to it. You know, back in the 80s, this is what you'd imagine futuristic buildings to look like, rounded and modular. I really like the design of these enemies and how they can create craters with their attacks. The sound is another big quality in this game, the sound effects, sound design. I feel like arcade games like this one and Defender had a really unique sound design that was instantly identifiable. These analog style, you know, computer sounds, or it sounds like it came from an analog synthesizer. Oh, and the mine part. The mine part was always really challenging for me as a kid, that getting the timing right. And it took me quite a bit of time to even figure out that you could add variable speed with, you know, pressing to the right or to the left. You would actually speed up or slow down your little moon buggy. But, you know, compared to a lot of other arcade games, this one's fairly simple. It doesn't feel like such a coin hog like some of those other games like Double Dragon or Final Fight, where you're just pumping quarters in there to survive. And what are some of your guys' favorite 80s arcade games? If you're watching this, leave a comment down below what some of your most memorable 80s arcade games are and what your memories are about them. can see at this point we're starting to get more intense with the enemy attacks and the variety of things that you have to be aware of. Now you're rolling up the hill with the boulders coming rolling down at you. You can jump over them, or I just choose to shoot them. If you time it correctly, you should be able to make it through there. But overall, yeah, it's a pretty mellow game. It's not super intense, fast action. It's got kind of segues from one section to another, and you get a break to just kind of gather your bearings. Oh, that's it. Those tank guys are so cheap. You have to completely remember that that part's coming up or have some extra lives. Because, yeah, you're pretty much guaranteed to die right there. I should have jumped. Alright, now how about some R-Type? Now this was a game that I remembered what it was in a grocery store that my mom would always go to called Smith's, and they had this right at the entrance. And of course, you know, as a kid, that's all you'd want to do is go and play this game. And my mom was usually half and half, so sometimes she would let me stay there, maybe give me $1 or a couple quarters, and just one quarter. And other times she'd be like, no, you have to come with me. And wow, this game was so impressive for its time. And I remembered seeing it everywhere at all, you go to different arcades through the years. So again, this is one of those games that's really kind of a timeless quality game, where it really set its position in stone for gaming history. And the follow-ups were all really good. The ports are good, and the sequels. It's just one of those really amazingly well-known series that's that horizontal scrolling shooter, which I'm so very fond of. I just think of Gradius and Life Force, and a ton of other side-scrolling 2D shooter games. But in a lot of ways, R-Type takes the cake for that time in terms of, the bosses and the power-ups and enemy designs, the biomechanical look, and I think that most other games at this time couldn't live up to the standard, the high bar that was set by this game. And you see it now, and it still looks amazing. Like, the sprite art is just so beautiful, and the design is so well made, and it does stand the test of time, in my opinion. You always have those standout bosses from this series too. So many great design bosses. That looks like one of Giger's aliens. So the influence of Giger's art on 80s video game culture is something you just can't hardly quantify. It's just immeasurable how much of an influence he's had over video games and lots of other popular culture in general. But the look on this stage is a bit more unique. It really has that kind of unique kind of almost gory kind of artwork, I guess. And then so much details to layers and animations of the enemies. So much opportunity for you to get killed, you know, enemies coming from all sides, and you know, as a player you just always want to look at the graphics and check out all the details and how amazing everything looks, which can catch you off guard because you might miss an enemy or a shot that's a straight bullet. I always accidentally run right into it. And this is a boss that I struggle with sometimes. Know that there's a specific way that you can kind of a strategy you can use to defeat it without getting much danger. But I always seem to forget exactly what that spot is or what the best strategy is. Yeah, I should have moved out of the way there. Yeah, and R-Type is from the lineage of 2D shooters where when you die it sends you back and without your power-ups, which can be so incredibly frustrating. I think I've heard people call it a recovery mode where you're always in this compromised state and you have to try and gather all your power-ups as quick as possible, or do everything in your power to avoid taking a shot in a bad position. And R-Type is one of those games I've never actually been able to complete. So I can usually make it probably to the stage where you fight the ship. Maybe the one after that, but not farther. I've never actually been able to beat this game. The stage with the green circles is probably the one where I always will guaranteed never pass that level. It's way too difficult. But as a kid, I would be happy if I could even, beat the first boss. I'd often lose at the first boss. And the Super R-Type, oh man, that game is really difficult. I always lose on the first boss, or on the second. I don't know. If I use save states, I can do pretty good on that one. But an R-Type 3 on the Super Nintendo is really good also. Definitely worth checking out that version. And also R-Type Leo in the arcade on MAME. Check out that game. I might show that one in a later episode of Retro Game Talk. Alright, and the last game that we're going to talk about is Heavy Barrel from Data East in 1987. Another 1987 game. That was a pretty awesome year. We had Black Tiger, R-Type, Shinobi. Some really phenomenal landmark arcade games from that time period. Now, Heavy Barrel was another one of those arcade games similar to Ikari Warriors that had a rotating joystick. So that was a really neat variable back then, when a lot of other games were just the standard like bat top joysticks. You would get these ones that it felt like the top of a screwdriver, and it would kind of make a soft little click as you would twist it around, and it was really satisfying to play, but very challenging. You had to really know what you were doing. But once you got the hang of it, man, these games, there was nothing really quite like these. I always think of Super C, you know, the top-down levels in Super C. That was some pretty good top-down gameplay. But the adding, you know, that ability to twist around through the joystick, that was a pretty neat addition. The weapons, I mean, this looks a lot like an Ikari Warriors game, down to the enemies and the weapons, the big flame shot. But the big draw with Heavy Barrel was the Heavy Barrel itself, right? So as a kid, that was like the only thing you wanted to do was get the Heavy Barrel and put it together and see just how phenomenal that was. And when it happened, it was amazing. You know, playing this game on MAME and just pumping quarters in, you can just get a great feel of how phenomenal this was for its time. You know, it just has this really neat idea behind it. You know, as kids, we were buying like Transformers and little toys like that. You would combine like Voltron, right? So a lot of that concept was there. We have this technology and you have individual parts and you put it together and then it becomes this super amazing kind of tool or whatever that you would use. And it was really impressive when you saw it. But this is a game that, you know, you would always talk about on the schoolyard, or when you got the chance to see it in arcade, it would be one of the first ones that you'd want to play. And the genre lived on for a pretty long time. I remember later in the 90s, Mercs came out, you know, a sequel to Commando. Very similar, you know, very detailed, you know, military theme game. A lot of really cool enemies, really neat level designs. And in my opinion, you know, this game, Heavy Barrel, is one of the ones that did it the best. It was the most memorable for these top-down, and I think it was because of that, the Heavy Barrel. You know, you just wanted to put that together. No other game had that same concept. Nobody really ripped it off, or that was just a really original idea to have that. There's another game, Midnight Resistance, used a similar key system where you'd have to collect keys to unlock the treasure boxes. Oh, and you can see things got pretty intense there. Alright, so that's about as good as I could do for 1 coin on these games. So if you haven't checked out these games, I highly recommend each one of them. Try them out in MAME, or of course you can find an arcade that has these nearby you. You should definitely check them out. And that's going to wrap it up for today, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a good one.